Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read-aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read an abridged version of Wild Nature Won by Kindness by Elizabeth Brightwen, 8th edition, published in 1898. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Exploration Dreamland. If you would like to recommend a text, please email us at explorationdreamland, all one word, at gmail.com. Before we begin, a small content note and a warning. Please be aware that the early sections of this book include occasional descriptions of pet deaths, some by misadventure or accident. If you prefer to avoid those, please rejoin us at episode 13. This book was written quite some time ago, and therefore does not necessarily reflect current-day outlooks, language choices, and husbandry practices. The scientific texts may use outdated terminology or be inaccurate in light of more recent discoveries. This podcast was created primarily to help you relax and to entertain you. The texts are chosen for their ability to charm and interest you rather than for educational purposes. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes, snuggle into your sleeping space, and listen to tonight's tale. Verdant. One day in early summer, I found on a gravel walk a poor little unfledged birdie, sitting calmly looking up into the air, as if he hoped that some help would come to him. Some pitying hand and heart have compassion upon his desolate condition. I carried him indoors and mothered the helpless little thing as well as I could by feeding him with hard-boiled yolk of egg mixed with brown bread and water. Being a hard-billed bird, I supposed that would be suitable food, and certainly he throve upon it. The little blue quills began to tell of coming feathers, his vigorous chirpings betokened plenty of vocal power, and in due time he grew into a young greenfinch of the most irrepressible and enterprising character. His lovely hues of green and yellow led to the name of Verdant being bestowed upon him, and his early experiences made it a somewhat suitable name. Poor little man, he had no parents to instruct him, and he consequently got into all manner of scrapes. He only learnt the nature of windows and looking-glasses by bitter experience. Flying against them with great force, he was often taken up for dead. But his solid little skull resisted all these concussions, and by pouring cold water upon his head and some down his throat, he always managed to recover. He once overbalanced into a bath and was nearly drowned. He fell behind a wardrobe and was nearly suffocated. Later on, he almost squeezed himself to death between the bars of his cage. In fact, he had endless escapes of various kinds. He was very amusing in his early youth. Whilst I was dressing, he would delight in picking up my scissors, pins, button-hook, and anything else he could lift, and would carry them to the edge of the dressing table and throw them down, turning his sly little head to see where they had fallen. He delighted in mischief, and was ever on the watch to carry off or misplace things, and yet he was a winning little pet, fearless in his confidence, perching on one's head or shoulder and hindering all dressing operations by calmly placing his little body in the way, regardless of consequences. He lived in his cage during the day, and next to him, on the same table, lived a bullfinch, a very handsome bird, but heavy and lethargic to a degree. He sang exquisitely, and for that gift I suppose Verdant admired him, for his delight was to be as near him as possible. Perched on the top of his cage, he gazed down at his friend, and in great measure imitated his singing. Bully, on the contrary, hated Verdant and would have nothing to do with him. The two characters were a great source of amusement to us. Verdant was always let out at meal times to fly about and enjoy his liberty, and I am sorry to say he was always on the lookout for any mischief that might be possible. Bully's water jar was fastened outside by a small pin. This Verdant discovered was movable, and before long we were startled by the fall of said water jar, the greenfinch having pulled out the pin. He then began upon the seed box, and that also fell, to his great delight. He was then talked to and scolded, and up went his pretty yellow wings with angry flappings, and his open beak scolded back again in the most hardened manner. He was greatly interested in watching the numerous birds frequenting a basket filled with fat which hung outside the window, and he would swing backwards and forwards on the tassel of the blind, chirping to the outsiders and watching all their little squabbles. Sunflower seeds were his greatest dainty. He would perch upon the hand to receive one, or, if it were held between the lips, he would flutter and poise upon the wing to take it. A sort of swing with a chain and movable wheel was provided, upon which Verdant soon learned to perch and swing, whilst he amused himself by pecking at the chain till he disengaged the sunflower seeds I had fixed in the links. When he was more than a year old, and I thought he might be depended upon, I tried the rather anxious experiment of letting him out of doors. He soon became quietly happy, investigating the wonders of tree branches, inquiring into the taste of leaves and all kind of novelties, when 2 or 3 sparrows flew at him and scared him considerably. Away he went, followed by the sparrows, and I began to repent my experiment, and feared he might go beyond my ken and lose himself. He was out nearly an hour, but at last he returned and went quietly into his cage. It seemed strange that the wild birds should so soon discover that he was not one of their clique, but I suppose Verdant revealed the secret by looking frightened, and the others could not resist the fun of chasing him. For more than a year and a half my birdie was a constant pleasure. Whenever he entered the dining room, my first act was to open Verdant's cage, when he would always fly to the bullfinch's cage and greet him with a chirp, then look to see if his friend had any provender that he could get at. A piece of lettuce between the bars, or a spray of millet to which he could help himself, no matter that Bully remonstrated with open beak, Verdant calmly feasted on stolen goods con gusto, and then scouted around for any dainties on the carpet, where he sometimes found a stray sunflower seed, always his greatest delight. After his summer molting, he became wonderfully vigorous, and would fly around the room with such velocity that I often felt afraid he might some day fly against the plate-glass windows and injure himself. The mournful day came at last. He had been out as usual at breakfast time, came on my finger for a seed, had his bath, and went on the little swing for more seeds, and flew about with all his joyous life and vigor. We had only left the room for a few moments, when, on returning, the dear little bird lay dead beneath the window, against which he had flown with such force as to break his neck and cause instant death. The sorrow of that moment will never be forgotten. Indeed, I cannot even now think of my little pet with undimmed eyes. He was a moment before so full of life and beauty, so fearless, such a sonsy little fellow. And then to think that I should never again have my cheery little friend to greet me and be glad at my coming was one of those sharp pangs that true lovers of nature alone can understand. From all such I know I shall have sympathy in the tragic death of my much-loved little Verdant. The Wild Ducks. When our grass was being cut, the mowers came upon a wild duck's nest containing 8 eggs. They were carried whilst still warm and placed under a sitting hen. In a week's time she brought out 8 fluffy little ducklings, which were placed with her under a coop in the farmyard. I paid them a visit the next day, but alas, I saw 4 little corpses lying about in the grass. The remaining 4 were chirping piteously, and the hen was in despair at being unable to comfort her uncanny children. Evidently their diet was in fault. I thought I would take them in hand, and therefore had the coop brought round to the garden and placed under the drooping boughs of a deodar near the drawing-room window where I could watch over them. I gave the wee birdies a pan of water and placed in it some finely shred lettuce with grits and brown breadcrumbs, not forgetting suitable food for the poor distracted hen. It was charming to hear the little happy twitterings of the downy babes, how they gobbled and sputtered and talked to each other over their repast, swimming to and fro as if they had been ducks of mature age and experience instead of mere yellow fluffs of a day old. And finally, they seemed to remember they had a warm, comfortable mother somewhere, and sought refuge under her kindly wings, where I left them exchanging confidences in little drowsy chirps. I found it needful to guard my little brood with fine wirework, for some carrion crows kept hovering near, and a weasel was constantly on the watch to carry them off. But these enemies were successfully baffled, and 3 of the ducks survived all dangers and grew to beautiful maturity, the 4th having died in infancy from an accidental peck from the hen. In rearing all wild creatures, the great thing is to study and imitate as nearly as possible their natural surroundings, and especially their diet. Chopped lettuce and worms made a fair substitute for their natural food, but the jubilation that went on when a mass of waterweed full of insects, water snails, etc. was brought them showed that they knew by instinct what suited them best. With constant care and attention they grew very tame, and would eat out of one's hand, and when let out of the coop would follow me to a certain heap of dead leaves where worms abounded, and there, with the most amusing eagerness, they pounced upon their wiggling prey, snatching the worms out of each other's beak, and tumbling over one another in their excitement, all the while making a special chirp of exceeding happiness. They were named Tiny, Sir Francis Drake, and Luther. I fear the last name had a covert allusion to the Diet of Worms. When the purple feathers began to show in their wings, and they considered themselves quite too old to pay any allegiance to their hen mother, they began to absent themselves for some hours each afternoon, and this too in a most secret fashion, for I could never tell how they disappeared, but they returned in due time, walking quietly in single file, and lay down in their coop. At last I traced them to a pond a long distance off. It really seemed as if they had scented the water, for they had to traverse a lawn and wood, go across a drive, and through a hedge and field, and then the pond was in a hollow where they could not possibly have seen it. But there I found my little friends in high glee, darting over the surface of the water, splashing, diving, sending up showers of spray from their wings, and going on as if they were possessed. I called to them, and in a moment they quieted down and behaved exactly as children would have done when caught tripping. They came out of the water and followed me in the meekest and most penitent manner back to their home under the deodar. These birds would stay the whole morning with me in perfect content if they were allowed to nestle into a wool mat placed at the doorstep of the French window leading out upon the lawn. There they would plume themselves and sometimes preen each other, and I could watch the way in which the feathers were drawn through the apparently awkward bill, yet I suppose so suited for its various uses. Anyway, the feathers came out from its manipulations as smooth and sleek as velvet, and when the toilette was over, the head found its rest behind the wing, and profound sleep followed. Sometimes my friends would make a spring upon the sofa by my side, I fear with a view to forthcoming worms, of which they well knew I was the purveyor, and nothing could exceed the slyness of their eyes as they looked up at me and mutely suggested an expedition to that heap of leaves. I must say I derived an immense amount of amusement from those ducks. They had such innate character of their own, quite unlike any other bird I ever came across. I had often looked forward to the time when they would take to their wings and come down upon the lawn from aerial heights with a grand fuss and fluttering of wings, but that desire they never gratified. The day came at last when I saw them circling high up in the air, so high that they were mere specks in the sky, but where they alighted I never could find out. They always reappeared, walking solemnly, the little hypocrites, one after the other, as if they had been doing nothing in particular and were now coming in exemplary fashion to be fed. I believe it is very rarely the case that wild ducks, however they may appear domesticated, will remain all the year through with those who have reared them and really take their place in the poultry yard with the other inmates. Still, it has been known, and I will subjoin an account given me by a friend, which goes to prove that such a state of things is possible. My friend gave me in substance the following account of her wild ducks. There are different kinds of wild ducks. These are mallards. The first we had were hatched by hens. They feed with the other ducks, but show a decided preference for corn. They are very troublesome about laying, often leaving their eggs exposed where the crows find them and carry them off. We gather most of them we find to take care of them, though the ducks lay in different places each time their nest is robbed, until there are preparations for sitting, when, If we have been fortunate enough to discover the fact, we add a number of the previously gathered eggs. The sitting duck comes for food every 2 or 3 days, and that is all we see of her for some time, until at length she may be seen coming through the meadow, the half-grown mowing grass behind her trembling and waving in an unusual manner. By and by, the road or shorter grass is reached. When it is found, the proud mother is bringing home her little fluffy family of perhaps 8 to 11 ducklings. Quick, active, tiny things that refuse at first all friendly advances, but becoming accustomed to their surroundings, soon behave much in the manner of their elders. There are dreadful fights on the pond when 2 or more little families arrive about the same time, the mother of one flock tyrannizing over the members of another, and thus causing many deaths. They often fly away, but they always come back again. All through the winter they go under cover with the other ducks, but when spring comes they are not to be found at night. Nevertheless, they are sure to be ready for breakfast next morning. I confess I always had a faint hope that my ducks might stay with me, or at any rate return from time to time, but their wild nature prevailed, and they finally left. Only Luther reappeared alone one day and took his last deed from my hand. But there was a look in his pretty blue eye which said plainly, "You will never see me again," and he had his final caress and departed, quote, "to fresh woods and pastures new," end quote. A young cuckoo. Looking out of my window before 6 o'clock one bright morning in early summer, I chanced to see a large bird sitting quietly on the gravel walk. Its feathers were ruffled as if it felt cold and miserable, and its drooping head told a tale of unhappiness from some cause or other. Whilst I was watching it, a little bird darted with all its force against the larger one, and made it roll over on the path. It slowly rose up again, but in another minute a bird from the other side flew against it, and again rolled it over. Such conduct could not be tolerated, so, dressing quickly, I went out, and picking up the strange bird, I found it was a young cuckoo, nearly starved to death, having, as I supposed, lost its foster parents. The bird was in beautiful plumage, except down the front of its throat, where the repeated attacks of the small birds in showing their usual enmity towards the cuckoo had stripped off the feathers. The poor bird was only skin and bone, nearly dying from lack of food and persecution, and made no resistance when I brought him in to see if I could act the part of foster mother. Finely mixed raw meat and brown bread seemed to me the best substitute for his insect diet, but he was an awkward baby to feed. Though sinking for want of nourishment, he would not open his great beak, and every half-hour he had to be fed sorely against his will, with many flapping of his wings and other protests of his bird nature. He would not stay quiet in any sort of cage, but when allowed to perch on the rim of a large basket quite free, he remained happily enough by the hour together. After a few days he grew into a vigorous, active bird, flying round the room, and too wild to be retained with safety. He was therefore let loose, and soon flew quite out of sight. I should hope he was able to support himself by his own exertions. I must say he showed no gratitude for my benevolent succor in his time of need. The taming of our pets. Since the love of animal and bird pets seems so universal, both amongst rich and poor, it is well that the desire to keep creatures in captivity should be wisely directed, and that young people especially should be led to think of the things that are requisite to make their pets live and prosper in some degree of happiness. I have often been consulted by some sweet impulsive child about its pet robin or dear little swallow as to why it did not seem to eat or feel happy, and have found the poor victims quietly starving to death on a diet of oats, canary seed, or even green leaves, the infant mind not feeling quite sure what the pretty birdies lived upon. It is needless to say we might as well try to keep a bird on pebbles as give hard grain to a soft-billed insect-eating bird, but this kind of cruelty is constantly practiced simply from ignorance. I would therefore endeavor to give a few general rules for the guidance of those who have a new pet of some kind, which they wish to domesticate and tame. To begin with animals, suitable food, a comfortable home, means of cleanliness, and exercise are essential to their health and comfort. These four requisites are seldom fully attended to. Often a large dog is kept in a backyard in London chained up week after week. Kept alive, it is true, by food and water, but without exercise, and with no means of ridding himself of dirt and insects by a plunge now and then into a pond or river. No wonder his piteous howls disturb the neighbors, and he is spoken of as "that horrid dog," as if it was his fault, poor fellow, that he feels miserable, and uses his only language of complaint. One would suggest it is better not to keep such a dog in a confined space in town. But if he is to be retained, he should have 1 or 2 daily scampers for exercise, the opportunity of bathing if he is a water dog, plenty of fresh water, dog biscuits and a few bones twice a day, and a clean house and straw for bedding. I would call attention to the piece of solid brimstone so persistently put into dogs' water pans. It is placed there with the best intention, but it is utterly useless, seeing it is a perfectly insoluble substance, but a small teaspoonful of powdered brimstone mixed now and then with the water would be lapped up when the animal drinks, and would tend to keep his skin and coat in good condition. Different animals need treating according to their nature and requirements, and surely it is well to try and find out from some of the many charming books on natural history all the information which is needed to make the new pet happy in its captivity. It is both useless and cruel to try to keep and tame newly caught, full-grown birds. After being used to their joyous life amongst tree branches, in happy fellowship with others of their own kind, living on food of their own selection, it is hardly likely they can be reconciled to the narrow limits of a cage and the dreariness of a solitary life. It is far better not to attempt keeping them, for what pleasure can there be in seeing the incessant flutterings of a miserable little creature that we know is breaking its heart in longings for liberty, and though it may linger a while, is sure to die at last of starvation and sorrow. No, the only way to enjoy friendships with full-grown birds is to tame them by food and kindness, till such a tie of love is formed that they will come into our houses and give us their sweet company willingly. No cruelty of any kind whatever should be tolerated for a moment in our treatment of the tender creatures we have been given to be a solace and joy during our life on earth. The taming of pets requires a good many different qualities, much patience, a very quiet manner, and a cheery way of talking to the little creatures we desire to win into friendship with us. It is wonderful how that prevents needless terrors. There are no secrets that I am aware of in taming anything but love and gentleness. Directly a bird flutters, one must stop and speak kindly. The human voice has wonderful power over all animated nature, and then try to see what is the cause of alarm and remove it if possible. In entering a room where your pet is, always speak to it, and by the time you have led it to give an answering chirp, the taming will go on rapidly, because there is an understanding between you, and the lonely bird feels it has a friend, and takes you instead of its feathered companions, and begins to delight in your company. A person going silently to a cage and dragging out the bottom tray will frighten any bird into flutterings of alarm, which effectually hinders any taming going on. But approach gently, talking to the bird by name, pull the tray quietly a little way, and then stop and speak, and so draw it out by degrees, and the thing is done, and no fright experienced. A better way still is to have a second cage, and let Birdie hop into that while you clean the other, and then it is amusing to see the pleasure and curiosity shown on his return when he finds fresh seed, pure water, and some dainty green food supplied. The loud chirpings tell of great delight and satisfaction, and the dreaded process is at last looked forward to as a time of recreation. It is much best that one person only should attend to the needs of a pet. Indeed, I doubt if taming can ever go on satisfactorily unless this rule is observed. A bird is perplexed and scared if plans are changed, and, not knowing what is required of him, he grows flurried, and the training of weeks past may be undone in a single day. Only those who have tried to educate birds can have any idea of the way in which their little minds will respond to affectionate treatment shown in a sensible way. They have a language of their own which we must set ourselves to learn if we would be en rapport with them. Their different chirpings each mean something, and a little observation will soon show what it is. For instance, my canary fairly shrieks when she sees lettuce on the breakfast table, and her grateful note of thanks when it is bestowed upon her is of quite a different character. So also is her tender little sound of rejoicing when I give her some broken eggshell. She seems to value it immensely, and chirps to me with a great piece of it in her bill, quite regardless of good manners. I often think with pain how much birds must suffer when hour after hour they call and chirp and entreat for something they want, which they can see and long for, and yet the dull-minded human beings they live with pay no heed to them. Food and water are given, but in many cases nothing more all day long, not even a little chickweed or groundsel, or the much-needed eggshell to supply strength to their little bones. A bright word or two for Birdie now and then, and a few friendly chirps as we enter the room, would do much to cheer the little prisoner's life, and would soon bring a charming response in fluttering wings and evident pleasure at our return. This state of things cannot be attained in a day or a month. It is only by persistent kindness, exercised patiently, until the little heart is won to a perfect trust in you as a true friend. Birds can easily be trained to come out for their daily bath and then go back to their cage of their own accord, but it needs patience at first. The bird must never be caught by the hand or driven about, but if the cage is put on the floor with some nice food in it, and the bird is called and gently guided to it, though it may take an hour to do it the first time, it will at last hop in, and then the door may be very quietly shut. Next time he will know what you wish and will be much more amenable, until at last it will be the regular thing to go home when the bath is over. It is a great help if some specially favorite food can be discovered by which the pet creature can be rewarded for good conduct. I never take away food or water to induce obedience by privation, a practice which I fear is often resorted to in training creatures for public exhibition. But an additional dainty I much enjoy to bestow, as a means of winning what is at first, it is true, merely cupboard love, but it soon grows into something far deeper, a lifelong friendship, quite apart from the food question. Cleanliness is a very important item in a bird's happiness. Whilst kept in a cage with but little sand and an outside water glass which affords no means of washing its feathers, a bird is apt to become infested with insects. It is tormented by them day and night, and having no means of ridding itself of them, it grows thin and mopy. There should be a bath supplied daily, suited to the size of the bird, and so planned that the cage itself may not get wet, else it may give the bird cramp to have to sit on a damp perch or floor. When its feathers are dry, some insect powder may be carefully dusted under the bird's wings, at the back of his head, where parasites are especially apt to congregate, and all over the body, only taking care that the powder may not get into the bird's eyes. The cage itself should be well washed with carbolic soap and water, all the corners scrubbed with a small brush, and when dry it might be sponged with carbolic lotion over the wirework to kill any insects which may yet remain. Birdie. Amongst all the different birds which are kept in cages, either for their beauty or song, there is one which to my mind far excels all others, not only in its vocal powers, which are remarkable, but for its very unusual intelligence. I refer to the Virginian nightingale. It is a handsome, crimson-plumaged bird, rather smaller than a starling, not unfrequently seen in bird sellers' collections, but seen there to the worst possible advantage, for being extremely shy and sensitive, and taking keen notice of everything around, the slightest voice or movement in the shop will make it flutter against the bars of its cage in an agony of fright, and it therefore looks a most unlikely bird to become an interesting pet. But I will try to show what may be done by gentle kindness to overcome this natural timidity. This will be seen in the history of Birdie, my first Virginian nightingale, my daily companion for 14 years. He had belonged to a relative, and there was no way of tracing the age of the bird when first obtained. I can therefore only speak of those years in which he was in my possession. Birdie had been accustomed to live in a cage on a high shelf in the kitchen, well cared for, no doubt, but untamed and unnoticed, he led a lonely life, and was one of the wildest birds I ever met with. For many months his flutterings when anyone came near his cage could not be calmed, but by always speaking to him when entering the room, and if possible giving him a few hemp seeds or any little dainty, he grew to endure one's presence. Then, later on, he would begin to greet one with a little clicking note, though still retreating to the furthest corner of the cage, and a year or two passed by before he would take anything out of my hand. But this was attained by offering him his one irresistible temptation, i.e., a lively spider. This he would seize and hold in his beak while he hopped about the cage, clicking loudly with delight. After a time, I began to let him out for an hour or two, first releasing him when he was molting and could not fly very easily. He learned to go back to his cage of his own accord, and was rewarded by always finding some favorite morsel there. Thus, by slow degrees, he lost all fear and attached himself to me with a strength of affection that expressed itself in many endearing little ways. When called by name, he would always answer with a special chirp and look up expectantly, either to receive something or to be let out. His song was very similar to the English nightingale, extremely liquid and melodious, with the same jug-jug but more powerful and sustained. On my return to the room after a short absence, he would greet me with delight, fluttering his outspread wings and singing his sweetest song, looking intently at me, swaying his head from side to side, and whilst this ecstasy of song lasted, he would even refuse to notice his most favorite food, as if he must express his joy before appetite could be gratified. After a few years, he seemed to adopt me as a kind of mate, for as spring came round, he endeavored to construct a nest by stealing little twigs out of the grate and flying with them to a chosen retreat behind an ornamental scroll at the top of the looking-glass. He spent a great deal of time fussing about this nest, which never came to anything, but he very obligingly attended to my supposed wants by picking up an occasional fly or piece of sugar and, hovering before me on the wing, would endeavor to put it in my mouth. Or, if he was in his cage, would mince up a spider or caterpillar with water and then, with his beak full of the delicious compound, would call and chirp unceasingly until I came near and made believe to taste it, and not till then would he be content to enjoy it himself. During an absence from home, Birdie once escaped out of doors and was seen on the roof of the house singing in high glee. The servants called him, the cage was put out, but all to no purpose. He evidently meant to have a real good time, and kept flying from one tree to another until he was 1/4 mile from home. A faithful servant kept him in sight for 3 hours, by which time hunger made him return to our garden, where he feasted on some raspberries, took a leisurely bath in a tub of water, and at length flew in at a bedroom window where he was safely caged. I never knew a bird with so much intelligence, one might almost say reasoning power. He was once very thirsty after being out of his cage for many hours, and at luncheon he went to an empty silver spoon and time after time pretended to drink, looking fixedly at me as if he felt sure I should know what he meant, and waited quietly until I put water into the spoon. Another curious trait was his sense of humor. Whilst I was writing one day, he went up to a rose, which was at the far end of the table, and began pecking at the leaves. I told him not to do it, when, to my surprise, he immediately ran the whole length of the table and made a scolding noise up in my face, and then, just like a naughty child, went back and did it again. He would sometimes try to tease me away from my writing by taking hold of my pen and tugging at a corner of the paper, and whenever the terrible operation of cutting his claws had to be gone through, he quietly curled up his toes and held the scissors with his beak so that it needed 2 people to circumvent his clever resistance. He had wonderfully acute vision, and would let me know directly a hawk was in sight, though it might be but the merest speck in the sky. He once had a narrow escape, for a sparrowhawk made a swoop at him in his cage just outside the drawing-room window, and had no one been at hand would probably have dragged him through the bars. Whenever he saw a jay or magpie, a jackdaw or cat, his clicking note always told me of some enemy in sight. For many years Birdie was my cherished pet. Never was there a closer friendship. As I passed his cage each night, I put my hand in to stroke his feathers, and was always greeted with a low murmuring note of affection never heard in the daytime. It was with deep concern that I watched Birdie's declining strength. There was no disease, only weakness, and at last appetite failed. But even then, he would take whatever I offered him and hold it in his beak, as if to show that even to the last he would try to please me as far as he could. But he wanted nothing but the quiet rest which came at length, and dear little Birdie is now only a cherished memory of true friendship. Stay tuned for the next segment from Wild Nature Won by Kindness by Elizabeth Brightwen. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter and Instagram, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find this and many other interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.